Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 7th week of 2014. For almost a quarter century, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and David Johnson. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, in the corporate media, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20-plus years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is February 14th, the third anniversary of the February 14th uprising, or the Pearl Uprising as it's called, by the people of Bahrain against their government. A series of demonstrations began on the 14th of February 2011, amounting to a sustained campaign of civil resistance in the Persian Gulf country of Bahrain. As part of the revolutionary wave of protests in the Middle East and North Africa that had begun in Tunisia, the Bahraini protests were initially aimed at achieving greater political freedom and equality for the majority Shia population, and expanded to a call to end the monarchy of Hamad bin Isa al-Khalifa. Let me see if I can get that right. The king is Hamad bin Isa al-Khalifa. There we go. Closer. I'm closer with that one. Sorry, did you have it, David? Khalifa?
I said a mouthful.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The initial outbreak, the initial demonstrations of 3 years ago led to a counterattack on the protesters in the Pearl roundabout. That's the square, the roundabout, the public area in the middle of the capital of Bahrain. And the suppression of that demonstration is known locally as Bloody Thursday. Protesters in Manama, the capital, camped for days at the Pearl roundabout. After a month, the government requested troops and police from the Gulf Cooperation Council. The Gulf Cooperation Council, or as Pepe Escobar calls it, the Gulf Counter-Revolutionary Council, is an association of the Emirates and the Persian Gulf and Saudi Arabia. And sure enough, on 14th of March, 1,000 troops from Saudi Arabia and 500 troops from the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, arrived in Bahrain to quell the protests. Now, there was an important actor off stage, as it were, or in the background. The United States Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. And it's no accident that Saudi Arabia, one of the two principal American clients in the region, provided the troops to put down the protests in Bahrain. The U.S. engineered that and indeed encouraged it. A day later, the King of Bahrain declared martial law and a 3-month state of emergency. The Pearl roundabout was cleared of protesters, and the iconic statue at its center, statue of freedom of the people of Bahrain, was torn down. After a state of emergency ended in the summer, the opposition party, the National Islamic Society, organized several weekly protests, usually attended by tens of thousands of people. In March of 2012, over 100,000 attended, and another on 31st August attracted almost as many. Daily smaller-scale protests and clashes continued, mostly outside Manama's business districts. By April of 2012, more than 80 had died in the police responses, a pattern we are all too familiar with. The police response was described as a brutal crackdown on peaceful and unarmed protesters, including doctors and bloggers. This was very much a nonviolent protest at the start. The police carried out midnight raids in Shia neighborhoods, beatings at checkpoints, and denial of medical care in a campaign of intimidation. Almost 3,000 people were arrested. At least 5 died due to torture in police custody. In June, the king established the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, composed of international independent figures to assess the incidents. The report was released in November and confirmed the Bahraini government's use of systematic torture and other forms of physical and psychological abuse of detainees, as well as other human rights violations. It also rejected the government's claims the protests were instigated by Iran. The report was criticized for not disclosing the names of the individual abusers and extending accountability only to those who actively carried out human rights violation, because, of course, this was not accidental. This was the policy of the Bahrain government, and behind it, the policy of the Saudis and the Americans. The demonstrations continue, as does the American-backed Saudi occupation, and the American fleet in presence, of course, in place, of course. And the Obama administration continues to support the Bahrain government's attempt to put down these popular protests, this local version of the Arab Spring. Meanwhile, the Obama administration is busily trying to overthrow a democratically elected government in Ukraine because it won't play ball with the U.S.-EU economic control. This came out in a farcical fashion just this last week when a senior State Department official of the last several administrations, the awful Victoria Nuland, was quoted as using an impolite word to refer to the Europeans. Well, the point of this was not the impolite word, but the revelation of the American policy that this uprising in Ukraine was being sponsored by the United States, supported by the United States, manipulated by the United States, and the leader of the protests was an out-and-out fascist. The U.S. was using that in order to make its own writ run in Ukraine and embarrass the Russians. One is reminded of the Carter administration's sending the worst jihadists it could find into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion of 1980 in order, as Carter's national security advisor said, to give the Russians a Vietnam of their own. Well, Washington learns nothing and forgets nothing in its dealings with Russia, it seems, and here we're trying to do it again vis-a-vis the Ukraine. So you're watching news from Neptune, where the Obama administration's counter-revolutionary policies are on view in Eastern Europe and in Southwest Asia, in Bahrain and Ukraine. An Obama love edition for Valentine's Day. We'll start with probably some local issues, I think, with David Green.
Yeah, well, before we go to that, I just wanted to mention the interview that Amy Goodman did a couple of weeks ago with Stephen P. Cohen.
Oh, yes.
About the Ukraine, and just ask you whether you think that what Stephen he debated somebody who's in favor of the rebellious party in the Ukraine, and Stephen Cohen gave more of a view like what you're referring to. So I mean, if you recall that, did you find that a reliable, from what you understand in the Ukraine? Did you find that a reliable understanding of what's going on there?
Yes, and if you would like to see Steve Cohen's updated views on this, you have to read a journal called The Nation, which I must admit I don't read very often, but Steve has an important piece in The Nation this week updating that discussion and giving a description of what's going on in Ukraine, and his theme is the American attempt to embarrass, to put no finer point on it, Putin and the Russian government is behind this. But the shocking aspect of it is how ill reported it has been in this country, how little is being said about what the U.S. is doing and moiling about in this dispute in Ukraine, and that seems to me right.
Okay. So you're gonna give Stephen P. Cohen a break, even though he's writing in the Nation and he's married to the editor of that.
Indeed, yeah.
We shouldn't hold that against him.
Probably doesn't have too much trouble getting his article published.
Probably not. Yeah.
But still, in all,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a principle that we have we've invoked every now and then on News from Neptune from the early days of this program as a radio program, and that principle is it was at various times been called an incompleteness principle. The incompleteness principle says that no one can be wrong all the time. And I would extend that to journals as well. I mean, the Nation doesn't always print nonsense. And here we have an example.
I mean, it's probably 50-50. I haven't read it for a while. I don't really know what the thing is. I know I like Dave Zirin. I like Jeremy Scahill.
Right.
So they're kind of dealing with a broad audience.
The Nation has such a long history running back into the 19th century of not being wrong all the time. You know,
right.
That one is doubly embarrassed when it is wrong so frequently.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be, that's what should be deplored.
Yeah.
You know, that they don't do better what they occasionally do well.
Yeah.
Or they don't do more often what occasionally they do well.
Mm-hmm. So you can see two versions of me, or you can listen to two versions of me from the last few days. If you go online, if you want to hear the NPR me, the relaxed me, the articulate me, you can go to my campaign website, and from there go to my Facebook page. You can like me if you're there, if you have your own Facebook page, and you can hear the interview that I did over in Normal on Wednesday with WGLT, which is the NPR station in Normal. Very good job, a good guy there named Charlie, who did a probing and I think has a good style for doing that and helped me to get out what I'm saying. This morning I interviewed very differently with a station down in Decatur called WSOY. And I knew what I was getting into when I got home. I got home last night from an interview in Springfield with the IEA, which went pretty well, and I got online to check out this WSOY and this morning program, and a guy named Brian, and I found out that George Gollin had taped an interview, or actually done a live interview with him last week, or maybe the week before last, I'm not sure. And I listened to it, 20 minutes, and I got an idea of what I was in for with this fellow Brian. So I have to thank George Gollin for kind of setting me up a little and knowing what I was going to have to deal with here. WSOY is a Fox News affiliate. So the guy was really into thinking that rich people already pay too many taxes. and I had to be very firm with him. I think out of the 20 minutes that I was on, I spoke for at least 18 minutes. I just bulldozed my way through this interview. I really didn't much let him get a word in edgewise, because I knew when he did, he was just going to be challenging me. He got frustrated with me, and sometimes when people get frustrated with people, he sort of played the elite university card, and at one point he said to me, "Well, we know you're really smart," as a way of putting me down. He said,
Right.
"We know you're really smart."
Which begs the question
Because
about
I kept saying really like truthful things to him about social class and the economy and so forth. But I was ready for the one thing that I thought that George hadn't done real well with. And that is challenging this idea that the rich pay too many taxes. If you go to the website for the Center for Citizens for Tax Justice, ctj.org, org, I guess, you will find very clearly that when you combine federal, state, and local taxes, that the lower classes pay about 20%. The middle classes pay about 25%. The upper classes, all the way up to the 1%, pay about 30%. That's the progressivity of our tax system, 20 to 30%.
I.e. not very progressive.
Not progressive. And it's because state taxes are regressive, sales taxes are regressive. Every state, when you combine state and local taxes in every state in this country, you find that poor people pay a higher percentage of their income than rich people. That is compensated for at the federal level, but of course not enough. And the reason that it is not compensated for enough, and that the rich people end up paying only 30%. And when you look at this, at the Citizens for Tax Justice thing, you see that like the top 1% pays about 29%, and the 4% after that pay about 30%, because all those really, really rich people pay even less, because so much of it is capital gains. And so much of it, of course, is beyond the Social Security, beyond the payroll tax cap. So people just don't have a concept of how little taxes wealthy people pay in this country, beyond even the whole issue of corporate welfare, beyond what has been figured out to be $6,000 per family of corporate welfare. There was a nice article about that by this guy who publishes an article every week on Common Dreams named Paul Buchheit, who kind of figured it out, and it's a little slippery, you know, what you include and what you don't include in corporate welfare. But he had the numbers, and it really adds up to about $6,000 per family, or about $700 or $800 billion a year. A good 4% of our GDP goes back to corporations in the form of tax breaks, corporate subsidies, and breaks for offshore tax havens, and all this finagling that corporations do when they sell stuff in other countries and don't repatriate the income. All this kind of technical stuff that adds up to, again, why rich people are rich, why poor people are poor, and why the government struggles to fund the basic things that people need. So a little campaign news as I see it. We'll be debating next Thursday at the Champaign City building. The two Republicans who've consented to debate each other than Rodney Davis, are going at 7. Rodney Davis is not participating in. I ran into him last night over at the IEA in Springfield, and he was real nice to me, and I was real nice to him, and I didn't ask him why he wasn't showing up. But the three of us in the Democratic Party primary are showing up: Ann Callis, George Gollin, and me. It's a little too constrained a format for me, but I figure it's the best we can do right now. And what's going on in the campaign is that Ann Callis is keeping to herself. Is running a very heavily scripted campaign, a very narrow campaign. George Gollin is trying to get Ann Callis to debate him more. He seems to leave me out of that. He seems to be pestering her about doing it, but not saying, you know, why don't you debate us? So I figured out maybe I should chime in, but I kind of want to leave it alone. And then
you think he wants to debate her and not you, huh?
Yeah, right. Well, he won't get away with that. He won't get away with that. But in any event, he is trying to triangulate, as far as I can tell, triangulate between Ann Callis and myself. He's accusing Ann Callis of running to the right of Obama, as the political phraseology goes, distancing herself from President Obama, not wanting to appear with him, or not saying straightforwardly that she would love for him to come and campaign in this district should she win. And after the State of the Union address last week, or week before last, whenever that was, George Gollin tactically came straight out and said, "I am foursquare behind I stand behind what Obama said in that very meager and deceptive speech, and apparently very long, 80 minutes.
A festival of lies.
A festival of lies.
Glenn Ford called it
Yes,
in the Black Agenda report. Yes.
So Gollin is standing between me and Ann, and of course I'm positioned to the quote-unquote left of all of that, although I don't like to label myself, but let's face it, it's what we like to call left. And the only kind of wrinkle is at it, it seems like George, and I'm not sure what his reasoning is with this, as we go through this campaign season and I listen to what his message are, what his talking points are, he seems to be, in the style of Obama, moving a little to his left, going a little to his left by saying, instead of saying that he would like Medicare lowered to age 55, he said, well, we should move towards Medicare for all, even though he's not harshly critical of the Obamacare, of the Affordable Care Act. And at the same time, he's saying that we should move towards, a government jobs program, like what I've been saying, and he hasn't used the word New Deal type. But I don't know whether he's going for those quote unquote progressive people who might think about voting for me, who might be under some kind of illusion that there's not a very meaningful difference between me and him, and that I actually represent the firmly progressive and leftist and social justice views in this, and populist views in this campaign. And one thing that George did is he's, to kind of, while moving to his left, one of the reasons he can't move to his left is this, that on Lincoln's birthday he came out with a statement quoting something that Lincoln said. And Lincoln said, I don't know if either of you guys came across this, but what Lincoln said was, there's nothing wrong with some people getting really rich, but we just want to make sure that everybody has a chance to get really rich. Yeah. And that people, and so that's the line that George is taking, that we don't want to criticize rich people. And the line that I took, and that I took quite straightforwardly on this W-Soy program this morning, was yes, there is a problem with rich people. There is a problem with the 1%. And because I knew that I was speaking to a right-wing audience, I decided to just very straightforwardly do what I think Noam Chomsky has been telling us to do, is to appeal to the Tea Party, to whatever grievances they might have, and make sure that I'm not on board with either Obama or the people that he works for, that I'm anti-war, that I'm anti-Wall Street. And I actually got one response. I got one email this morning from somebody who'd heard the program. Might be a lawyer. I'm not sure from the email. It looked like it might be a lawyer. But in any event, that was a different me. Again, as I said, that was a different me on the radio this morning. I didn't feel all that great about it afterwards, but I've been feeling better about it ever since.
Good. We should point out here that David is running for in the Democratic primary on March 18th. David is a candidate for the seat in the House of Representatives from the 13th Congressional District of Illinois. That includes most of our listening area. He is opposed by an official Democratic candidate, so to speak, Judge Ann Callis. He's opposed by an unofficial Democratic candidate, Professor George Gollin. Now, all three will appear at a debate on Thursday. Is that right, David?
The 20th.
Thursday, the 20th, and when and where again?
Champaign City Building. The Republicans debate at 7 and Democrats at 8, and they will be an hour. Or actually, they're saying 55 minutes or so for each debate.
And I should point out again, as we have here before, that David's presence on this show means that we have an open invitation. We've issued an open invitation to Ann Callis and George Gollin to come on the show and talk about the issues in the campaign, which are so studiously avoided in most political campaigns these days. To talk about the issues in the campaign, how would they vote in Congress is a question that I would like to ask each of the candidates. So far, no one's taken up our invitation, but if they wish to, we would certainly love to make the time available between now and the Democratic primary on the 18th of March. You're listening to News from Neptune. Carl Estabrook, David Green, and David Johnson talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. And before I forget, I want to mention another program note, another upcoming thing. David, you have a program tomorrow on WEFT, the Illinois World Labor Hour, and you have a particular a special program tomorrow, don't you? Is tomorrow the South African program?
Yes, indeed. Tomorrow on what Labor's Worldview, we're going to be having.
Labor's for I'm sorry,
not Labor's Worldview. Sorry, that's my UPTV program here.
Right.
It's World Labor Hour, and I have to get in the radio mode now.
Yeah.
Yes, World Labor Hour radio on WFT from 11 a.m. to 12 noon every Saturday tomorrow. And we'll be having Professor Ken Salo and Professor James Kilgore on to talk about recent developments in South Africa. Both Ken Salo is a native of South Africa, and James Kilgore is an American citizen, but he lived for many years in South Africa. And what's interesting about South Africa right now is that it's, of course, everybody knows about the struggle against apartheid and the ultimate, defeat of the racist apartheid government in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, one of the leaders of that, recently died. But what a lot of people don't know is everyone thinks it was a happy ever after story as far as the defeat of the right-wing neo-fascist racist apartheid government and the advent of Nelson Mandela and the ANC, the African National Congress. Well, unfortunately, what happened shortly after the successful revolution in South Africa was that the leadership, the ANC leadership, sold out to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and basically allowed corporations to come in and to put austerity onto their own people. In other words, low wages, few if any government benefits, services. And there's been a revolt within South Africa, particularly within the labor movement. There was a miners' strike here last year in which I think it was up to 80 miners were actually surrounded by the police and gunned down. I mean, there was 80 deaths. And there was video footage that was released short time after that showing that the police had actually brought hearses along with them before they engaged the striking workers. So they basically had every intent of killing as many of the protesting strikers as possible, which they did. So what's happened is the South African Labor Confederation, one of the largest unions in that federation, the Metal Workers Union, has basically broke ties completely with the ANC. Now, this is quite a spectacular development. I mean, it would be the equivalent of a major union in, say, Britain breaking with the Labour Party, or a major union in Germany breaking with the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, or here in the United States, a major union totally breaking with the Democratic Party. So this is quite a development. I think it might be a trend to come worldwide, and it's just good to see and hear about finally there's some real leadership within a labor movement somewhere in the world that's willing to represent its workers and the working people in general of the country, as opposed to kowtowing to corporate interests.
And once again, we as Americans should look on these stories with reference to the fact that they're not just an account of things that are happening far away by people whom we hardly know, as was once said. No, this is something that the United States was desperately and deeply involved in from the beginning. It was astonishing to me that with all the commemoration of Nelson Mandela and the proper celebration of his important role in the transition from apartheid in South Africa, with all the media coverage we got in this country, we got almost no coverage of what role the United States actually played in those days in trying to suppress the movement that Mandela was the tip of the spear of for a while, and more importantly, no coverage whatsoever of how the U.S. had backed apartheid South Africa to the bitter end, that was American policy, and it was American policy that was not just accidental, but bound up with the general worldwide foreign policy of the United States. And a concomitant, there was little, if any, mention of the Cuban role in the overthrow of apartheid. That's just amazing. In fact, it was precisely the military activities of Cuba in Africa that brought apartheid down, that meant that South Africa, with American support, was not able to maintain control of Southwest Africa, and finally not able to maintain the apartheid structure of South Africa. The story that David is arranging to have told on his radio program is a further dimension that has gone unmentioned, and that is the fact that the overcoming of apartheid occurred in such a way that the capitalist power structure of South Africa was willing and able to put a black face on its government, but wasn't willing to change that government or society, and that in many ways South Africa today ended apartheid in order to protect the forms of capitalist oppression that South Africa had developed and which exist to this very day. So it'll be important to hear from your guests who know the situation firsthand and on WEF tomorrow at 11 o'clock on the community radio station mentioned above. You're watching News from Neptune. Other comments, let's see. I wanted to mention that there is an aspect of the Obama administration that seemed to me to be on display recently in these discussions of inequality and as it came out in that State of the Union speech. And that is the fact that in a rather crass athletic metaphor, the Obama administration has been adept at faking left and driving right. And that on the question of inequality, which has emerged with some force in recent discussion, not to the delight, certainly, of either the administration or its Wall Street backers. On the question of inequality, the administration seems to be doing exactly that. And if I understood what you said a moment ago, David, your opponent in this congressional primary
faking left and driving
exactly
right.
Right.
Yes,
faking left and driving
yes,
right.
you know, couldn't put it in better. I should have thought of that myself.
Well, as I say, it seems to be that's where he's drawing his politics from the basketball court, and he has for a long time, I think. But on particularly, it seems to me the question of inequality is very interesting. We're reading about inequality for the first time in regard to American politics, and that can't be comfortable for either the administration or its principal backers. They don't want to talk about inequality, and as a result, we've seen for years the question being swept away, ignored, put aside, and it's just become less and less possible to do that in America since the financial crisis. We can't put inequality aside. So the Obama administration felt they had to do something about it, and what they had to do, of course, was a propaganda line. They had to do something about it, and the result was the faking left, driving right. Faking left by saying, oh yes, inequality is a problem. Driving right by saying, and our answer for it is opportunity.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, that's practically a quotation from the State of the Union speech.
That's exactly, you took the words right out of my mouth. The word right out of my mouth, one of the most degraded words in the English language, opportunity.
And it is such a smokescreen, not to put too fine a point on it, it's such a way to try to misrepresent what this administration has done, or more importantly, what it hasn't done. The Obama administration came into office with a clear mandate to do something about job loss in this country, and there was much talk about it, and the opportunity talk succeeds the job talk, and it will probably have about as much effect. Remember, it was obvious what the administration should have done. They should have done the sorts of things, thing that you bring up in relation to your campaign when you speak of a New Deal, the sort of things that to produce jobs the New Deal did, the Works Progress Administration. We needed a larger one of those. It should be the case that anyone who needs a job should be able to go to a government agency and be provided with a decent job at a living wage. There is no technical reason that can't happen.
No.
The only reason it can't happen is that if the government does indeed put in an effective jobs program, the ability of major American employers to extract surplus value from the populace will go down a bit. They won't be able to hire people at less than living wages as they so commonly do. And there's another aspect of this administration attempt to cover their failure to do what they should have done, and that's this talk of minimum wage. Yes, it's a good idea to raise the minimum wage, but the administration's discussion of raising the minimum wage is another smokescreen. What they're going to do is a sop, something small and inoffensive to American business in general that will indeed, yes, do some people some good, but not enough. If it reminds you of something like the Affordable Care Act, you wouldn't be far off. This is the style.
Well, it's not going to, I mean, the 10-10 minimum wage, it's so easy, and Obama was so proud of himself for thinking this up so that he could say it's easy 10-10, you know, and and it doesn't apply to that many people. It applies to federal contractors and not even all of them, people working under federal contracts and not even all of them, and it's kind of grandfathered in, you know, so just not impressive. I mean, people have been calling for, you know, the fight for a $15 minimum wage. That translates into about $30,000 a year if you work full time. I think when I started this campaign, and I remember when I taped that interview with you, David, first interview, it just came to me that what we need in this country is for government employment to put a floor under the labor force. We need government employment at a living wage with the benefits that go along with that, to put a floor under the economy, that the private sector, and to provide enough jobs and enough opportunity, you know, to provide a job for everyone who wants one, or even everyone who has a job who would like a better job, to put a floor under this economy, to have a kind of spine in this economy, a kind of stable spine that you need as capitalism, as we understand full well that capitalism goes from bubble to bubble, from crisis to crisis, and that after each crisis, the most vulnerable people among us find themselves being poorer and poorer and more vulnerable and more desperate. So the government employment needs to set a standard by which then, with full employment, the private sector will have to follow if it wants to keep its workers and make its profits. You need to tighten up this labor market so that they have to pay a higher wage if they want to keep those workers, and it should go up to $15 an hour pretty fast. And of course, even the productivity, when you talk about the gains in productivity of the last 30, 40 years that haven't been compensated for in minimum wages or just basic wages, we're talking no reason why people working a full-time job shouldn't be making $30,000, $35,000, $40,000. We can well afford that.
Take on the inequality debate, David?
Well, I mean, go to the root of this. I mean, why is it that we've come to this situation now to where there's so many people that are unemployed? And by the way, the official unemployment rate does not reflect the reality of what the real unemployment rate is.
As most people know about the sectors where they work themselves, they know that's true.
Indeed.
So they know from their family and friends, they know that's true.
Indeed. The other big problem, of course, is underemployment. That's much larger than unemployment. I mean, it's very difficult to get a part-time job now.
Yep.
And when you do get a part-time job, it's like very rarely does it pay over $10 an hour. Yeah. What's been the cause of this? Well, it started back when our elected leaders of both political parties, both the Democrat and the Republicans, started under Bill Clinton, Democratic president, with the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which exported American jobs. It continued with also under Bill Clinton with the China Trade Preference Treaty, which dropped all trade barriers with China and look what happened. I mean, go to a store now and try to find anything that's not made in China. I mean, this is what's happened. They've exported our basically jobs. At the same time, they've allowed employers to exploit undocumented workers here. It's amazing how technically the employers break the law, but they get a slap on the wrist at best, and the undocumented worker gets thrown in jail, sometimes held for a year, and then deported. And this makes for a perfect situation of fear for these undocumented workers to try to, first of all, unionize or even to report abuses by their employers, like not paying overtime or paying way below the minimum wage. So what you look at what's happened. Oh, in addition to that, there's the HB1 visas, which bring in skilled professions, software designers, engineers, even electricians. From not just Asia or also from Eastern Europe. So this has basically had an effect. What does you think about it, what does this had? An export of jobs and an import of cheap labor that's exploitable. Because the HB1 visa program, basically any of these workers they bring in, they're indentured servants. I mean, they basically are brought in by a corporation, and if there's a falling out with that corporation, then the person is basically their visa is revoked and they have 2 weeks or so to leave the country. It's indentured servitude. And so what you've happened is that you have an import of cheap labor and export of jobs. I mean, this is the root cause of it. But so beyond that, I mean, yes, I mean, as far as immigration policy, I'm not opposed for HB1 visas if they pay the same wages that's common in either whatever industry they're taking a job in, engineering, whatever, as any other person they'd hire that was an American citizen. Likewise with lesser skilled labor. I think the penalties should be on the employers, and that there should be no penalties on an undocumented worker if they report abuses to federal agencies or they want to unionize. It's all about the exploitation. Who's really benefiting from this? That's the whole thing. And it's been corporate America. And so to move beyond that, I mean, $15 minimum wage is a start. But it's not enough. I mean, we need to have full-time employment at living wages, and we need to have the jobs to do it. So there's other policies that could be enacted. I mean, there could be simply some reasonable company-specific trade barriers put up in the sense that if a company uses sweatshop labor to produce their products, then that should be taken into account when they import products into this country. In other words, tax them on the differential between what wages they're paying their workers in some third world hellhole and what the average worker in the United States will be making in that industry. That's one method. I mean, the other thing too is health care. That's a big problem in this country. Obamacare, or otherwise known as the Affordable Care Act, was one of the biggest frauds perpetrated on the American people. It has basically expanded the privatization of health care in this country. It's strengthened the private health insurers. After all, they're the ones that wrote the Affordable Care Act. Single payer or Medicare for all health care is what's needed. It's like what's done in every civilized, well-developed country in the world, and even some lesser developed countries, to where everybody, from the time they're born to the time they die, have medical care. I mean, the other big problem, too, here is student debt. I mean, everything from preschool through up to PhD should be totally free. It should be paid for by the taxpayers. And this is the whole thing, is that, the Republicans and other corporate Democrats try to make a big thing about taxes, but the thing is that a lot of working class people that own their homes have to pay really large property taxes. I mean, if you had more of a progressive income tax on people that were wealthy, there could be property tax relief on working class people who own their homes. There's all sorts of programs that can be done. Not to mention, as far as the jobs again, we've got a crumbling infrastructure in this country, both physical as well as our electronic, so to speak, infrastructure. Telecommunications could be greatly upgraded. We're very much behind Europe and Japan on that. We could develop alternative energy, solar, wind, and other things that can be done. Not to mention high-speed rail. China is very, very advanced with high-speed rail. I mean, within the last 10 years, they've went from virtually no high-speed rail to where they have not only their entire country connected, but they've got routes into neighboring Asian countries, and they have plans to go all the way to Istanbul in Turkey. I mean, this is amazing. Well, think about all the jobs that could be provided to do just some of what I mentioned. And there's other things, too, that could be mentioned. I mean, you get into an issue, though, of course, of control. And one of the problems that prevents people from doing this is basically the corporate control of our government through campaign financing and lobbyists. That's just a start. I could go on and on. So let's pause for now.
You're absolutely right. The only thing that I would add to that, David, is that the corporate control and the question of money in politics and so forth, this is some sense a roundabout way of getting at this. What we're talking about here is a government structure that is run for the purposes of Wall Street, for the purposes of American business and the upper reaches of American business, while pretending that it is working for the community as a whole. That's the primary job. That's why Obama got the job. He's good at this. He's good at convincing people, as the State of the Union speech was supposed to do, that something is being done about equality. We're going to make opportunity available. This is smoke and mirrors, because the actual policies that the government follows, which should be what we pay attention to, redound to the profit of the few, the profit of the corporations, and destroy the economic viability of the majority of the population. These are not technical problems. The answers to the questions how to do this, how to provide jobs, say, or something of that sort, are all there. There's an immense amount of work to be done. Look out across the world, everything from the pothole that I hit coming in today to the questions of housing and teaching and all the other issues that the society needs. Immense amount of work to be done, and an immense number of people who can do it. But it's simply a society that is doing something else that fails to put the two together. Now, the failure to put the two together in order to provide greater and greater profits for fewer and fewer people at the very top has to be explained away. It can't be seen. It can't be recognized. And the job of our interpreter-in-chief in the White House is to cover sin with smooth names, to make sure that people realize that his heart is in the right place and that he really is thinking about making opportunities available for you and your kids and so forth. But gee, these problems are difficult and it will take time. This is simply false. What's being done is something else. And until Americans start saying that we realize now that you're working for Wall Street, you're not working for us, and we want you to start doing different things, until Americans start saying that to the federal government, to the president, to the political structure in general, it's not going to happen. The interesting thing that I think these days is that they're worried about it. The American government, for the first time in a while, I think, is worried about the possibility of Americans seeing through the scrim and noticing what's going on and demanding that it change. And they really are worried. That's one of the reasons they suppressed things like Occupy Wall Street with such vigor. We can't let this get out of hand. We started the day today by talking about the 3-year-old revolution in Bahrain and how that had to be put down before something serious happened. Planners in Washington look at these things. They look at the Arab Spring. They look at what's going on around the world, and they say, we're kidding ourselves if we think it can't happen here. We have to be ready for it.
You know, Carl, a good point about elections, too, as well. We should talk a little about Honduras. You know, it's interesting because I have a good friend of mine whose wife is originally from Honduras. And, you know, we've talked before about how's it phrased? Well, basically the problem of a good example for the elites in Washington,
the threat of a good example, right.
And what happened was the Honduran people have been living under some various types of military dictatorship for years. I mean, this started back when the United Fruit Company that basically went in and pretty much ran the whole country for years. And now it's a little more sophisticated, a little more subtle. But the Honduran people elected a president a few years ago, a man named Zelaya. That was actually first time in a ever in Honduras that somebody was elected that was really going to try to do something for the average Honduran enduring people. And he got taken out in a military coup. Right. What was our government's response to this? Oh, it was because he violated the Constitution. Yeah. Well, his violation of the Constitution was he was trying to make the country more democratic in a voter referendum. Okay, that's what he did. And of course, Washington denied for, so long that they had any part in this coup. Well, WikiLeaks came along and released some documents that proved that that was an outright and total lie, that our government backed that coup and advised the coup participants on how to proceed. Because they're afraid of examples like Venezuela, like Ecuador, like Bolivia, and other countries in Latin America that have basically started going their own way and actually doing things to help their own people. But of course, when a government ever does that, of course, they're vilified in the corporate media here as dictators and tyrants. So what irony, considering these people were some of the first ever elected in a truly democratic election and re-elected time and time again.
And this is a wonderful example of the fact that the other thing that is keeping people awake in Washington right now is the revolt of the South, the revolt of South America from the worldwide economic control that the U.S. has exercised, well, at least since the Second World War, and regarding Latin America since the 19th century. We can't have that. There are bad signs on the horizon here when things like this happen, and therefore we have to put the lid on in places like Honduras to make sure that the infection doesn't spread, a favorite trope of the American government.
And when they can't do that, they steal the elections by fraud. This is what happened recently in Honduras. They finally had another election, and by all accounts of observers are saying that they just they're dumbfounded as to how the candidate that got elected, considering all the polls. Well, imagine that. Right. What happened in Mexico in 2006 with Choice Point, the same company that stole the election in Florida in 2000, that resulted in George W. Bush being appointed by the Supreme Court in 2000, and then again with voter fraud in Ohio and Florida again and other places around the country in the 2004 election. This is, but when they go to the extent of stealing elections, rigging elections, that they're worried. And then, of course, following that, something like Occupy Wall Street happening, which was, inspired by the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and other places that, by the way, our government didn't back. Again, when there's a legitimate, revolt of the people and the want change, this is what they do. And yes, Carl, you're absolutely right. The elite 1% and their how should I put it? Their servants in politics, who they buy and pay for, are very, very worried because the American people are getting fed up.
That's the interesting point.
Yes,
I think that's right, and I think they're worried about that in Washington.
Yeah.
You got a point,
Let
David?
me just, I just wanted to, in relation to the immigration issue, I just wanted to mention that the CU Immigration Forum is sponsoring a forum on Sunday, in 2 days, that would be the 16th, at the Champaign Public Library from 3 to 5, and they've invited the candidates to come. And I'm not sure if it's just the candidates or there may be some other speakers there on this issue. This is a result of the interest in this issue by Channing Murray and by the YMCA, by the Campus Y. And so I will be there, and I know George Gollin will be there, and Callis will not be there. Rodney Davis will not be there. Lots of people will not be there, but I will be there. I don't have time to list all the people who won't be there.
Yeah.
But we will be there from 3 to 5 on Sunday at the Champaign Public Library. And these are complex issues. I think this is the toughest issue that I had to sort of make a statement about, and I went back and forth with it because the bill that was in the Congress was inadequate in so many ways and didn't offer the kind of quick and necessary path to citizenship that the immigrants whose labor is profited upon by the corporations of this country and has been for 400 years deserves in this country. And there's many aspects of this. You mentioned the HB1 visa. I keep getting mixed up with the flu.
I wonder what they're connected.
Yeah, right. But still, these are complex issues that have to do with globalization and with NAFTA and with American workers and the idea that American workers won't do these jobs when in fact they just won't do them because they don't pay what American workers ought to get. There's lots of issues here, so I'm going to try to address some of these things on Sunday. And also, just one little thing, the housing issue, it was kind of mentioned, kind of gets left aside in the history. The housing policy, suburbanization, public housing, the way it's gone down in this country, especially since World War II, is an important issue, and I haven't dealt with it enough in this campaign. And it really affects housing wealth. Really affects a lot about our country and this economic inequality, and probably deserves to be spoken about much more.
You're watching News from Neptune. We have only a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to take a couple of them to mention a point that I think will start, not end, a discussion. David Johnson mentioned the question of property taxes and income taxes and how we need a more progressive tax structure. I agree with the general point. It's not at all clear to me that what we need is a more progressive income tax. Remember, if you tax something, you get less of it. That's the theory behind things like taxing cigarettes or even taxing gasoline. The idea that you get less gasoline burnt if it's more expensive. Well, whether that works or not, I don't know. But the notion certainly is that a tax is supposed to minimize the use of whatever it is that you're talking about. If that's true, then we shouldn't be taxing income probably at all, or at least not very much. And that we're going to say something nice about the Tea Party here. The calls in recent years for low flat taxes on income make a fair amount of sense. But if you're going to put a low flat tax on income, you need to create taxes someplace else, and you need to make them progressive, really progressive, in ways that David was sketching that the present tax structure is not. Now, the way to do that, of course, is to tax wealth, or if you like, to tax property. The problem is now our notion of property taxes is only a tax on real property, the property that people actually live on. And taxing wealth, we find ourselves taxing what people need to live on in terms of money. Let's tax the property that people don't need. Let's tax the property that's differential. Let's tax away that inequality that we were talking about and that where people are finally noticing is growing in this country. Now, the way to do that, it seems to me, is to tax investable assets, not net worth. Investable assets, the money that you use to play the stock market, and put a limit on it. Tax the investable assets over $1 million. If you've got more than $1 million worth of investable assets, you should be taxed on that. That's fine. And in fact, the numbers work out such that we could do quite a remarkable job of producing a viable tax structure by taxing property in the sense of investable assets. A long argument, and I hope my colleagues will come back to later shows here, absolutely, to talk about this. And it would be good if we would have these things talked about in our political discussion. There are the discussion now about progressive taxes in this country, and even in David's campaign, is primarily, and other campaigns that we might mention around town, are mainly about progressive, making the income tax more progressive. We should make the tax structure more progressive, and that may mean, in fact, running down taxes on income. This is News from Neptune, and this is fuel for further discussions. This is, if our program interested you, by the way, there are other programs here at News from Neptune that you may want to look at, particularly this week's In Focus from Deutsche Welle, the German national network. They have a special program this week, The Terror Divide in Syria. Radical Islamists tighten the screws. And I'm reading their description of the program now. The civil war in Syria is not only about toppling Bashar al-Assad and his regime. The opposition is itself deeply divided, with radical Islamists fighting secular rebels as well as religious minorities such as Shiites and Christians. The web of conflicts threatens to further destabilize the Middle East. The effects are also being felt in Germany. This is a German program, after all. More and more German Islamists are going to fight in Syria or menacing Muslims who do not share their extremist ideology. That's once again the description of the program as provided by Deutsche Welle. It'll be seen here on Urbana Public Television in place of the Populist Dialogues this week. It'll air Saturday at 3 p.m., Sunday at 3:30 p.m., next Wednesday at 10:30 p.m., and next Thursday at 1 p.m. That's The Terror Divide in Syria from Deutsche Welle. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussers tonight on News from Neptune have been David Johnson and David Green. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week. If not next week, then soon, I hope, with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.